In the heart of 15th century Europe, a child was born into a world trembling on the edge of chaos. Her name would one day echo through England's chronicles, not as a saint nor a scholar, but as a queen of fire and fury. She would be called the she-wolf of France. But before the battles, before the bloodshed, before the crown and its curse, there was simply Margaret. In an age when kingdoms were won and lost by the swing of a sword or the whim of a marriage treaty, the world welcomed a child destined to shake the foundations of empires. On March 23, 1430, within the thick stone walls of the castle of Pont-à-Mousson, Margaret of Anjou was born, a child of ancient bloodlines, and a spirit already bound to the storms of history. She entered a world that glittered with chivalry, but seethed beneath the surface with ambition, betrayal, and war. Her cradle stood at the crossroads of two great realms, the French crown to the west and the empire to the east, a frontier where the banners of kings had long risen and fallen like waves upon a restless sea. Her father, René of Anjou, was known to history as Le Bon Roi René, the good King René. He was no mere noble. He was the very embodiment of a medieval dreamer, a poet, a painter, a composer, and a scholar. He believed that the soul of a ruler should be adorned with wisdom as much as gold. Yet for all his grace and imagination, René's life was one of continual struggle. He was Duke of Anjou and Bar, Count of Provence, and, by claim if not possession, King of Naples, Sicily, and even Jerusalem. His titles were as many as his misfortunes. In the endless chessboard of 15th century politics, René was both player and pawn. He inherited claims to faraway thrones that others already coveted, and spent his life chasing shadows of crowns that dissolved before his eyes. He was captured in battle, imprisoned for years, and ransomed at ruinous cost. Yet through it all, he never lost the gentle nobility that defined him. While captive, he painted scenes of saints and angels upon the walls of his cell, proof that even in chains, his mind remained free. It was from this man that Margaret inherited her father's poetic vision, his capacity for grandeur, and perhaps his tragic sense of destiny. Her mother, Isabella, Duchess of Lorraine, was of another mold entirely. Where René was the dreamer, Isabella was the realist. Sharp-minded, politically cunning, and unflinchingly courageous. When her husband was taken prisoner by the Duke of Burgundy, it was Isabella who refused to kneel. She took command of Lorraine in his absence, called the nobles to her side, raised armies, and ruled with an authority that astonished even her enemies. At a time when most women were expected to fade into the background, Isabella stood unshaken at the front of her council chamber, her voice calm, her gaze unwavering. Margaret grew up beneath that gaze. She watched her mother handle diplomats and soldiers alike, mastering both compassion and command. From Isabella, she learned that leadership was not given. It was seized, maintained, and defended. The House of Anjou, the dynasty to which Margaret belonged, was among the most illustrious in all Europe. Descended from kings, entwined with emperors, the Angevins carried within them both splendor and curse. They were a family of builders and conquerors, poets and warriors, saints and schemers. They had once ruled half of France, held courts of brilliance in Sicily, and claimed the very title of King of Jerusalem, a title no longer real, but heavy with symbolism. Their coats of arms glittered with lilies and golden lions, yet behind that heraldic beauty lay centuries of bloodshed and ambition. Every Anjou child was born with the expectation of greatness, and with the shadow of downfall close behind. Yet, despite their noble blood, the Anjous of Margaret's generation lived more in struggle than splendor. War and ransom had drained their coffers. Their once great estates were fractured among claimants and rivals. René himself was often absent, caught in campaigns to reclaim lost lands or defend fading claims. Margaret's early life, therefore, was not one of idle luxury, but of movement, uncertainty, and whispered fears. Her mother's household was mobile, shifting from castle to castle, seeking safety from both political enemies and the ever-looming specter of Burgundy's power. The child's memories were not of golden halls, but of narrow corridors lit by flickering torches, the smell of wax and steel, and the constant murmur of plotting voices. She would later recall those days not as hardship, but as education. In those shadowed halls, she learned the silent languages of power, the glance across a council table, the pause before a lie, the weight of a promise made for convenience rather than loyalty. From her father, she inherited imagination, the ability to dream of worlds that might yet be. From her mother, she inherited resolve, the unyielding strength to endure the world as it was. Together, these two influences forged in her a mind both visionary and ruthless, a queen's mind, long before she ever wore a crown. To understand Margaret of Anjou, one must first understand the world that bore her. A Europe still reeling from the 100 Years' War, where thrones changed hands and crowns rested uneasily. A time when the faith of kings was tested by greed and ambition, when knights spoke of honor but practiced betrayal. Margaret's bloodline carried both the heritage of saints and the hunger of conquerors. Her ancestors had ruled Sicily and Jerusalem, but she would inherit a kingdom not yet hers, one that waited across the sea, fractured and restless. And as she grew within the castle walls of her youth, surrounded by the echoes of chivalry and the cold breath of war, Margaret began to understand one truth. That greatness was not a gift of birthright. It was a struggle, a fire kindled in the soul and tested in the crucible of history. She would soon learn that crowns are not ornaments of gold, but burdens of blood. They are not given freely. They are wrested, often painfully, from the hands of fate itself. And so, from the union of a dreamer and a warrior was born the spirit of a queen, a child destined to command armies, defy kingdoms, and be remembered not as a gentle consort, but as the she-wolf of France. The castle of Nancy in the heart of Lorraine was no peaceful nursery. It was a fortress, part court, part command post, where the affairs of nations were decided not by kings, but by a woman's will. And within these walls, a young Margaret of Anjou grew to understand the language of power. She did not learn her lessons from books alone, nor from the soft voices of tutors and governesses. Her classroom was the council chamber. Her teachers were soldiers, envoys, and her mother, Isabella, Duchess of Lorraine, a woman whose strength had already defied the age she lived in. When René of Anjou was taken prisoner in 1431 by the Duke of Burgundy, his duchy fell into peril. The Burgundians were powerful, their armies disciplined, their ambitions vast. Most noble women would have retreated into quiet obedience, awaiting rescue or the mercy of fate. But Isabella was not most women. She took control of Lorraine with the confidence of a born sovereign. She called her council to order and declared, "The duchy shall not fall. My husband's absence is no void. I will rule in his stead." At her side stood the small, watchful figure of her daughter. Margaret observed every movement, how her mother held herself before men who underestimated her, how she commanded loyalty through calm rather than cruelty, and how she wielded silence as power. It was a dangerous time for Lorraine. Armies marched across its borders, and emissaries from Burgundy and France alike sought to claim influence over the duchy. Every alliance was a gamble, every word a weapon. And young Margaret, still scarcely 10 years old, listened to those words as if they were scripture. She learned that strength was not always measured by the sword. Sometimes it was the firmness of a voice that could still a room. Sometimes it was the ability to see through a flattering smile or a false promise. And always, it was the courage to make a choice and to live with the consequences. Her mother taught her diplomacy in its purest form, not the art of pleasing others, but of outlasting them. Each morning, Margaret would see her mother at work, seated beneath the tall, stained-glass windows of the council hall, her hands resting on letters sealed with wax, her face illuminated by the cold light of dawn. Men twice her age would bow before her, their armor glinting, their pride tempered by respect. Isabella did not shout. She did not threaten. She ruled through the weight of intellect, through preparation, foresight, and unwavering composure. Margaret's young mind absorbed these lessons not as theory, but as survival. She understood that being born noble did not make one powerful. Power had to be crafted, with patience, with endurance, with the ability to see the truth behind every mask. And when letters arrived from distant courts, from Paris, from Provence, from Anjou, Isabella would read them aloud to her daughter. She explained the tone between the lines, the dangers hidden in courteous phrases. Margaret learned that every greeting carried an agenda. Every gift demanded a return. Through her mother's example, she saw the burden of leadership, the sleepless nights, the long silences before decisions, the loneliness that comes with command. But not all her lessons were gentle. Margaret also witnessed the cost of rule, the betrayals, the executions, the necessity of hardness. One winter's evening, a messenger arrived bearing grim news. A vassal had broken faith with Lorraine, selling secrets to Burgundy. Isabella listened to his confession in silence. Then, in a voice as calm as the falling snow outside, she gave the order for his arrest. To the young Margaret, it was a moment of revelation. Her mother did not flinch, nor weep, nor explain herself. She acted because she must. And from that night on, Margaret understood that mercy is a choice of the strong, not the weakness of the fearful. In an age when the church preached submission and the poets sang of obedient queens, Isabella of Lorraine lived as proof that a woman could be sovereign without apology. She guided her daughter not toward gentleness, but toward greatness. She often told her, "The world remembers the weak as victims and the strong as legends. Choose, my daughter, which you will be." Margaret did not answer. She did not need to. Her gaze was steady, her small hands clenched with the quiet certainty of one who already understood her path. As years passed, Isabella's counsels became Margaret's education. The names of dukes and counts, the borders of Lorraine, the treaties with France and Burgundy, all became familiar terrain in the young girl's mind. She learned to read not just words, but expressions, not just documents, but destinies. And when her father, René, returned from captivity, Margaret saw the difference between his gentle dreams and her mother's steel. René spoke of poetry, of art, of harmony among nations. But Isabella lived in a world where such harmony was only won through will. Between them, the girl absorbed the duality of kingship, compassion and control, mercy and authority, faith and pragmatism. These conflicting ideals would later define her own rule, torn between the heart of a poet and the mind of a general. The lessons of Lorraine were not written in books, but in blood and fire. They were the foundation of everything she would become. For when the time came, when England's crown would rest upon her brow and rebellion would tear her realm apart, those early memories would return. The calm voice of her mother, the steel in her eyes, the unspoken creed of survival. It was in Lorraine, long before the Wars of the Roses, that Margaret of Anjou was truly forged. Not in battlefields or palaces, but in the echoing halls where a mother ruled as regent, and a daughter learned what it meant to rule at all. From her mother, she inherited a truth that would follow her to the throne of England, that a queen's power is not in her crown, but in her will. The world Margaret of Anjou was born into was one drenched in smoke, ruin, and uneasy silence, a silence that lingered after a century of endless war. France, her homeland, was a wounded kingdom. For more than 100 years, the French crown had battled the English for dominance, over land, honor, and the very right to call themselves the rulers of France. The 100 Years' War had not only shattered cities, it had broken spirits, scattered families, and turned the soil of Europe red with generations of blood. The English still held vast stretches of land across the north, Normandy, Gascony, and much of Aquitaine, regions that once flourished under French rule, but now bowed beneath the banner of St. George. Villages smoldered, abbeys lay in ruin, and farmers plowed their fields under the shadow of garrisons flying English standards. Every road, every river, every fortress stood as a reminder that the peace of Europe was as fragile as glass. At the heart of this chaos sat a newly crowned king, Charles VII of France, known by some as Charles the Well-Served, and by others as the King of Bourges. For once he had ruled only a sliver of his broken realm. He was the king who owed his crown to the courage of a peasant girl, Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orleans, whose fiery faith had once lifted France from despair. Yet Joan was long gone now, executed as a heretic and abandoned by the very nobles she had helped to restore. And Charles, though crowned at Reims, still struggled to unite a kingdom fractured by pride, greed, and the scars of war. In this world of shifting alliances, marriage was not a matter of love. It was a weapon sharper than any sword. Kings traded daughters like coin, sealing truces with wedding rings and betraying them with new vows. Peace was a temporary illusion, built upon parchment and promises that burned as quickly as they were signed. Margaret's family, the proud house of Anjou, was caught deep within this intricate web. Her father, René of Anjou, was a man of titles and dreams, Duke of Anjou, Count of Provence, King of Naples in exile, and by some claims, King of Jerusalem. But titles were wind without armies, and René's ambitions were often outmatched by his misfortunes. He was a man who preferred the brush to the sword, whose mind painted worlds of chivalry and romance, even as the real world crumbled around him. It was her mother, Isabella of Lorraine, who ruled with fire in her blood and steel in her voice. She understood that survival demanded cunning, and that in a world ruled by men, a woman must wield intelligence as her blade. Isabella had defended Lorraine from invaders, outwitted scheming dukes, and held her lands firm while her husband dreamed of lost crowns. From her, Margaret learned the cruel truth of power, that mercy was often mistaken for weakness, and that the world never forgave softness in those who sought to rule it. By the time Margaret reached her 12th year, her name had already become a subject of discussion in the courts of Europe. Letters crossed borders, envoys whispered her virtues. Her beauty, her sharp mind, her royal blood. She was not yet a woman, yet already her life was being bartered like a treaty. To France, she represented a bond, a bridge between the ambitions of Anjou and the uncertain throne of Charles VII. To England, she would soon become a prize, a chance to forge peace between two nations that had bled each other dry. And to her own family, she was both daughter and destiny, the key to restoring their fading influence. Margaret's education was no idle pastime. Her tutors spoke of kingdoms and saints, of the art of rhetoric and the subtleties of courtly persuasion. She was taught not only to read poetry and scripture, but to interpret glances, silences, and the shifting loyalties of men. From the chroniclers of old, she learned that queens could shape nations. From her mother's example, she learned that they could also destroy them. In the great hall of Nancy, she would sometimes sit beside her mother as ambassadors arrived, men in heavy cloaks bearing messages sealed with the wax of foreign crowns. Margaret would listen quietly as Isabella measured every word, weighing their offers against her own ambitions. The child watched, memorized, and understood. This was the language of power, patient, poised, and merciless. Beyond Lorraine, Europe itself seemed to tremble. The Burgundians, once allies of England, began to waver in their loyalty. The French court whispered of renewed strength, of lands reclaimed and enemies turned upon each other. But peace was an illusion. Every gain was bought with betrayal, every alliance with blood. The people of France prayed for rest, but none came. War had become the rhythm of their lives, an inheritance passed from father to son. In this fractured kingdom, Margaret's destiny was forged, not in comfort, but in conflict. She grew up surrounded by the scent of parchment and steel, the sound of soldiers drilling in the courtyards, the echo of her mother's commands resounding through stone corridors. She was both noble daughter and silent observer, already preparing for the world that awaited her beyond the castle walls. And somewhere across the Channel, in England, a weary king named Henry VI struggled to keep his own kingdom from splintering apart. The threads of fate, though unseen, were already weaving their pattern. 2 crowns, 2 wounded nations, and 1 young woman who would be asked to unite them, or perish beneath their weight. For soon, Margaret of Anjou would be summoned to a destiny greater than any she could imagine. A destiny not chosen by love or by faith, but by the will of men who saw in her a means to end a century of war. But peace, as she would learn, was not a gift granted to queens. It was a battle, one she would fight for the rest of her life. In the cold corridors of the Château de Tarascon, education was not a privilege. It was a duty, a birthright, and a weapon. Here, young Margaret of Anjou began to forge the most dangerous tool any ruler could possess, an independent mind. Her mornings began before sunrise, as the mist still clung to the hills of Lorraine. Candles flickered in brass holders. The scent of ink and parchment filled her study chamber. A governess would appear, curt and punctual, to begin the lessons of the day. Latin grammar, the Psalms of David, and the histories of ancient kings and fallen empires. Every line, every verse, every word carried a moral lesson, for Margaret was not merely being taught to learn, but to rule. Her father, René of Anjou, though often absent and consumed by his artistic and poetic pursuits, had one gift that would mark her for life: imagination. He filled her world with stories, of knights who fought dragons not for glory but for honor, of queens who held their crowns through wisdom rather than force. He painted saints and martyrs, and spoke of the ideals of chivalry, mercy, courage, and loyalty. But in these tales, young Margaret also sensed an unspoken tragedy, that her father's dreams were too delicate for the brutal world he lived in. She loved him deeply, yet she understood, even as a child, that gentleness without strength could not survive the game of kings. Her mother, Isabella of Lorraine, taught her the other half of truth. From Isabella she learned that compassion must be tempered by calculation, and that mercy should only be given when it strengthens the giver. Her mother's lessons were not read from parchment. They were lived, seen, and felt. She watched Isabella handle petitions, calm angry nobles, and silence entire councils with nothing but a measured stare. In those moments, Margaret understood the unspoken hierarchy of power, that even among men with swords, the one who mastered silence commanded the room. Her education expanded beyond books. She studied the histories of Rome and Carthage, of Eleanor of Aquitaine, and the legendary Semiramis of Babylon. From them she learned that women, too, could build empires, if they dared to defy the boundaries set for them. When her tutors spoke of diplomacy, she listened as though to music. When they spoke of faith, she questioned as though born for the pulpit. But it was the story of Joan of Arc that haunted her most. That name, whispered still in the markets and chapels of France, stirred something fierce within her. She would sit by the fire, eyes fixed on the dancing flame, listening to her governess recount how the maid had ridden forth in shining armor, hearing voices from heaven, defying kings and cardinals alike. Margaret's heart burned at the injustice of it, the betrayal, the pyre, the smoke that rose over Rouen. From Joan she learned that the world feared two kinds of women, the silent and the strong, and she vowed never to be the first. Margaret's tutors often complained she was too bold in her opinions, too sharp in her questions. She did not accept answers simply because they were spoken by men. When asked to memorize scripture, she asked instead what it meant. When told that obedience was a woman's greatest virtue, she replied that obedience was the virtue of servants, not of queens. It was not insolence that drove her, but an unrelenting curiosity, an awareness that the world she was born into would not be kind to women who hesitated. In the courtyard, between lessons, she trained with the daughters of knights, riding, hawking, even practicing archery. Though such pursuits were frowned upon for noble women, Isabella allowed it. She must learn to stand firm, her mother said, for there will come a day when no man will protect her but herself. Those words stayed with her like scripture. As the years passed, Margaret's reputation within the Anjou court began to grow. Visitors remarked not only on her beauty, the clear, pale skin and deep eyes of her mother's line, but on the gravity of her bearing. She spoke with the precision of a scholar and the restraint of a sovereign. When she entered a room, the conversation dimmed, as if something ancient and unspoken had taken notice. Even the most seasoned envoys would later admit there was something in her gaze, a command, a quiet fire that seemed to strip pretense from men's words. Her education had done more than fill her with knowledge. It had given her vision. Where others saw chaos, she saw opportunity. Where others saw war as destruction, she saw it as the crucible of destiny. The peace her tutors prayed for seemed to her like a fragile dream, beautiful but doomed. She understood that only those with the will to act could carve order from ruin. At night, she would walk through the long corridors of the castle, past the portraits of her ancestors, dukes, counts, kings, each framed in shadow. She would study their faces by candlelight, wondering what they had sacrificed to build their legacies. She felt their presence like silent judges. One day, she swore, her name would hang among them, not merely as a daughter of Anjou, but as a queen whose memory would not fade. Her governess, years later, would write that even as a child, the Lady Margaret had eyes that made silence fall upon a room. They were eyes not yet hardened by grief, but sharpened by purpose. The gaze of a girl who already understood that destiny is not inherited. It is earned. Margaret of Anjou was not born a queen. She was forged into one. Her mind was tempered by the wisdom of poets, the discipline of scholars, and the ruthless resolve of her mother. Every lesson, every silence, every story whispered beneath candlelight prepared her for what would come. For soon, the girl of Lorraine would step from the classroom to the throne room, from a scholar's world of ideas into the blood-stained theater of kings. And there, she would learn the cruelest lesson of all, that knowledge gives power, but power demands sacrifice. By the late 1430s, the kingdoms of Europe stood on uncertain ground. The century-long struggle between England and France had left both crowns exhausted, their treasuries drained, their people weary, their kings uncertain of what peace even meant anymore. For generations, the two realms had bled each other dry across the fields of Normandy, Poitou, and Aquitaine. Now, after so much ruin, a question lingered like smoke over the embers of war. Could peace ever truly exist between them? In England, the war-born kingdom was ruled by King Henry VI, young, gentle, and devout. Unlike his father, the warrior Henry V, whose sword had carved victory at Agincourt, Henry VI carried no taste for blood. He was more monk than monarch, a king of prayer, not conquest. His council whispered that his piety was noble, yet dangerous, for the throne of England was no place for saintly dreams. The nobility around him had grown restless. Men like Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, and Cardinal Beaufort saw the crown slipping toward weakness. The people grumbled of lost lands, of soldiers returning maimed and poor, of ships too few to defend their shores. The glory of England's empire in France was fading, and every noble sought to find someone to blame. Across the English Channel, in the court of Charles VII of France, the winds were shifting as well. Charles, once derided as the King of Bourges, had reclaimed much of his father's lost kingdom through cunning, patience, and the blood of loyal men. Yet even he knew victory was not complete. France still trembled under the scars of war, its borders uncertain, its coffers thin. And so, his ministers turned to the oldest and most dangerous weapon in diplomacy: marriage. Letters began to cross the channel, coded words cloaked in politeness, each line a veil for ambition. England sought peace, but France demanded concession. France offered amity, but England demanded honor. Between the ink and the silence, a single name emerged again and again, a name that seemed to carry both promise and peril. She was barely 15, yet her beauty, intellect, and lineage had already become the talk of Europe's courts. The niece of Charles VII, the daughter of René of Anjou, and the granddaughter of kings. She represented the living bloodline of both France and the ancient house of Anjou. She was more than a princess. She was a bridge, one that could connect two warring crowns, or collapse beneath their weight. To some, she was the key to peace. To others, she was a spark that could reignite the fires of war. The negotiations began in secrecy. The English king's advisers, led by the ambitious William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk, sought to arrange a marriage that would secure Henry's peace with France, but at a heavy price. The terms proposed would require England to surrender Maine and Anjou, territories fought for over generations of bloodshed. To the English lords, this was nothing less than betrayal, an insult to the memory of Henry V and the soldiers who had died under his banner. But Henry VI, ever guided by conscience rather than calculation, saw only the hope of unity, of divine reconciliation between brothers divided by sin. He believed Margaret would be his angel of peace. He believed she would calm the storms that had haunted England for 100 years. He did not yet understand that she would become the storm itself. In Lorraine, word reached the court of René of Anjou. Envoys bearing English colors arrived, their cloaks heavy with sea salt and secrecy. They came not as conquerors, but as suitors, speaking of peace, of alliance, of destiny written in royal blood. René, ever the dreamer, was delighted. He saw in the proposal a chance to restore the honor of his house, to see his daughter seated upon one of the greatest thrones in Christendom. But Isabella of Lorraine, shrewder and colder in her judgments, saw beyond the pageantry. She knew what England truly sought, not a bride but a scapegoat. Still, she played her part, for in a world ruled by men, refusal was a luxury few women could afford. Margaret was summoned. The girl who had spent her youth in the quiet study of books and faith now found herself at the center of a grand and perilous game. She listened as her mother explained the alliance. Her father spoke of destiny, and the envoys painted a portrait of a king, pious, wise, gentle. They said he sought not war, but peace. They said he was a man of God. They said he would cherish her as his queen. She was 15. How could she have known that across the sea waited not peace, but a crown of thorns? In the months that followed, preparations began. Gowns were sewn, treaties written, and painters commissioned to depict the young princess who would soon cross the Channel. But in England, murmurs grew darker. Rumors spread that the king's ministers had sold the birthright of Englishmen for a French bride. The nobility seethed in quiet outrage, whispering that Margaret's arrival would mark the beginning of England's decline. To them, she was no angel. She was a serpent sent by France. And yet, across the waters, in the cold corridors of her father's castle, Margaret prepared herself. Not as a child, but as one who understood that queenship was both crown and chain. She spent long nights in prayer, asking God for wisdom. She walked alone through torchlit halls, her footsteps echoing against the stone, the sound of a girl leaving behind her innocence. When dawn finally came, she stood on the walls of the Château d'Angers and gazed toward the west. Beyond the horizon lay the mist-shrouded island of England, her new home, her new kingdom, her new battlefield. The wind tore through her veil. Below her, the river churned like molten silver, and in that moment, as her mother's voice faded behind her and the ships waited at port, Margaret of Anjou stepped into history. She was no longer a daughter of Lorraine. She was the future Queen of England. And though the court poets would sing of her grace, her beauty, her courage, none could yet imagine the storm that would follow her across the sea. For beyond the white cliffs and the quiet abbeys of England, the gathering shadows waited, a kingdom divided, a nobility hungry for power, and a fragile king whose crown would soon depend upon the will of his queen. In the heart of Westminster, beneath the high, echoing vaults of the abbey, a young king knelt in prayer. His crown gleamed dully in the candlelight, not as a symbol of power, but of burden. This was Henry VI, King of England and Lord of Ireland, the heir to a legacy of conquest, yet the son of a warrior he could never emulate. Where Henry V had been bold, fierce, unyielding, and forged in the fires of Agincourt, Henry VI was meek, withdrawn, and unworldly. He sought not glory, but grace. He did not dream of armies, but of angels, and so he prayed, endlessly, for guidance, for peace, for deliverance from the curse of endless war that had ravaged both England and France for more than a century. Yet outside those sacred walls, England trembled. The empire his father had carved in France was collapsing. The treasury ran dry. Merchants complained of taxes, nobles whispered of rebellion, and the common people, tired of bloodshed and famine, cursed the king's name in taverns and marketplaces. And in the midst of that growing discontent stood the king's council, divided and seething with ambition. The Duke of Gloucester, Henry's uncle, still held dreams of renewed war, a man of proud blood and fiery temper who could not bear to see the empire slip away. Across from him stood Cardinal Beaufort, the king's great uncle, a man of the cloth but also of iron resolve, who saw the crown's survival in diplomacy rather than conquest. And presiding between these two titans of ambition was the Duke of Suffolk, cunning, eloquent, and ambitious beyond measure. He had risen through courtly grace and quiet manipulation, and now he saw a chance to bind the king to his will through a single act, a royal marriage. Suffolk leaned close to the king one winter evening, speaking softly of peace and providence. He spoke of a princess, noble, beautiful, virtuous, the niece of Charles VII, King of France. Her name, he said, was Margaret of Anjou. Her dowry would be modest, her family noble, her blood French, but her heart, he promised, could be made English. Henry listened. He listened with a mind yearning for light, for reconciliation between two kingdoms drenched in each other's blood. Where others saw a political gamble, Henry saw divine intervention. In his eyes, Margaret was not merely a bride. She was a symbol of peace, a living covenant between England and France. The council argued for months. The Duke of Gloucester roared that England was surrendering its pride, its honor, and the hard-won lands of Maine and Anjou, trading them for a girl and empty promises. The Bishop of Winchester countered that the crown could not afford more war, that the coffers were bare, that peace, any peace, was better than ruin. And amid the voices, Henry remained silent, his hands clasped in prayer. At last, when all words had turned to ash, he spoke only this: "If God wills peace through marriage, then peace it shall be." His voice trembled not with fear, but with faith. And in that moment, the fate of England shifted upon the fragile shoulders of a 15-year-old girl across the sea. In France, the message arrived with pomp and ceremony. Envoys from England, robed in fine wool and crimson, rode into the court of René of Anjou, a king without a kingdom, a poet without wealth, yet a man of lineage and dreams. René received them with cautious joy. He was fond of grand ideas, of tournaments and poetry, of pageantry and destiny. And what grander destiny could there be than his daughter seated upon the throne of England? But beside him stood Isabella of Lorraine, his queen, watchful, pragmatic, and far less enchanted. She had seen how swiftly fortune turned upon the highborn. She had heard the whispers from England, of noble feuds, of a weak king, of a court devouring itself from within. And she feared what awaited her daughter across that cold, gray sea. Still, refusal was impossible. To deny the English king would be to invite his enmity, or worse, his war. And so the treaty moved forward, signed in candlelight and sealed in crimson wax. The marriage was decreed. Maine and Anjou, those long-contested territories, would be quietly restored to France. In return, Margaret would become Queen of England. Margaret of Anjou, only 15, but already aware of the world's cruelty, stood at the edge of womanhood and history. Her tutors had spoken of England, its proud knights, its green hills, its storms. They had spoken of Henry VI, her future husband, kind, pious, and gentle. But in the depths of her heart, Margaret sensed the truth. That peace bought through surrender was a fragile thing. In her private letters, she wrote of obedience and duty. But her eyes, as sharp as her father's wit and her mother's caution, revealed something more. A spark. A quiet, defiant fire that would one day blaze across a divided realm. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The court of Anjou transformed into a stage of preparation. Seamstresses stitched gowns of velvet and gold. Artists painted her portrait to send to England. Priests prayed for safe passage. In the great hall, René composed a poem for his daughter's departure, his voice breaking as he spoke of love and destiny. And when the final dawn came, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Margaret descended the steps of the Château d'Angers draped in white and silver, her crown a circlet of lilies, the flower of France. The people gathered to watch her go, whispering blessings and fears alike. They saw not merely a princess leaving her home, but a chapter of France's soul-setting sail into the unknown. At the harbor, the ships waited, banners of England snapping in the sea wind. Envoys bowed deeply. Margaret's ladies wept quietly behind her, while Isabella stood rigid, her face carved of stone. She took her daughter's hands in her own and said softly, "You go not to a kingdom, my child, but to a court of wolves. Guard your heart, and never show them fear." Margaret nodded, though her throat burned with unspoken dread. And as the ship pulled away, the shores of France faded behind her like a dream slipping into mist. In England, news of the king's decision spread like wildfire. Some rejoiced, praising the young queen-to-be as a sign of God's mercy and hope for peace. But others, knights, merchants, and lords, seethed with fury. They saw the marriage as treason, as betrayal of all that had been won by blood and steel. Rumors festered. They said the king had sold England's honor for a woman's smile. They said she was a witch, a French serpent sent to poison the crown. They said peace would come only when England was on her knees. And amid that rising storm of resentment, the Duke of Suffolk tightened his hold upon the king. He stood beside Henry as preparations began for Margaret's arrival, whispering reassurance, flattery, and prophecy. Suffolk knew the girl's beauty would charm the court, at least at first. But more than that, he knew the king's gentle heart would cling to her like a man drowning in a sea of politics, too vast for him to swim. Henry's prayers grew longer. Each day he knelt in the abbey, thanking God for what he believed was a miracle. He imagined Margaret as an angel descending to calm the strife of his realm, to bring peace not through might, but through love. He saw her not as a partner in rule, but as a symbol of his divine mission. He could not yet see that angels, too, cast shadows. As the ship carrying Margaret approached England's southern coast, a storm gathered. Winds tore through the sails, waves crashed like beasts upon the hull. Below deck, Margaret clutched a small crucifix, her first prayer as England's queen. Above, sailors shouted into the wind, their faces pale with exhaustion. But the ship held, driven forward through rain and fury. When at last the storm broke, the first sight of England emerged through the fog, white cliffs rising from the sea like the bones of ancient gods. Margaret stood at the prow, soaked by rain, her eyes fixed upon the horizon. The world she had known was behind her. Ahead lay the unknown, a realm that would crown her, break her, and remember her forever. And so the decision of a king became the journey of a queen. Henry's faith had chosen her, fate itself had tested her. And as the wind carried her ship toward the shores of England, history, patient and merciless, prepared to meet its newest player. The peace Henry sought was not to be found in prayer or treaty, for in seeking salvation through love, he had awakened the lion within the lamb. The year was 1445, a year that would mark both an ending and a beginning. Across the banks of the river Loire, dawn broke slowly, spilling golden light upon the mists that clung to the hills of Anjou. The wind carried the mingled scents of salt, smoke, and spring rain, the breath of a changing world. At the port of Nancy, banners of France and England fluttered side by side, their silks torn by the same wind that whispered through the crowd. Knights in polished armor stood shoulder to shoulder with merchants, priests, and courtiers. It was not a royal procession, yet there was something sacred about the moment, as if all of Christendom held its breath. For today, the daughter of René of Anjou, the poet-king, would leave her homeland forever. Today, Margaret of Anjou, 15 years old, bright of mind, fierce of heart, would cross the sea to become Queen of England. She had not slept the night before. In her chambers, she stood by the window long after the candles had burned to waxen ghosts. Beyond the glass lay the dark outline of the river, the ship's masts swaying gently like trees in a storm. Each creak, each distant bell, seemed to echo a single truth. That childhood was behind her, and destiny waited beyond the sea. Her ladies whispered prayers as they packed her final belongings, silks, jewels, letters, and a single painting of her mother. Among them was her childhood friend, Jeanne de Laval, whose tears fell freely, though she tried to hide them. Margaret only smiled, not from joy but from resolve. Already she wore her new identity like armor. In the quiet before dawn, her father came to her chamber. René of Anjou, that king without a kingdom, that dreamer of impossible dreams. He had written songs in her honor, drawn heraldic emblems for her marriage, and spoken of her destiny as if it were poetry itself. But now, as he looked upon his daughter, his voice faltered. He said softly, "You go to England as peace incarnate. But peace, my child, is often bought with the sword. Remember that he pressed a small silver cross into her palm, one he had carried during his own exile." She looked at him, not as a daughter, but as one monarch to another, and whispered, "Then I will wear it as both shield and weapon." He smiled through his tears. He saw in her the fire of queens long gone, Isabella of France, Joan of Arc, women who had stood unflinching before men who underestimated them. Later, as the sun rose, the royal procession made its way to the harbor. The docks were alive with motion, sailors shouting orders, cranes swinging barrels aboard, priests blessing the voyage with holy water that glittered on the air like rain. The people of Anjou had gathered along the walls to watch, to catch one last glimpse of the girl they called their Lily of Lorraine. Some cheered, some wept. Others simply bowed their heads. At the edge of the pier stood Isabella of Lorraine, her mother cloaked in black velvet. She had been a queen all her life. Through famine, through exile, through courtly humiliation, And now, she faced the hardest of all farewells. Margaret approached her, her gown sweeping the wet planks. For a long moment neither spoke. The wind hissed between them, tugging at their veils. Then Isabella said quietly, "My daughter, remember, a queen must learn to smile when her heart breaks. You are no longer mine alone. You belong now to England, and England will not be kind." Margaret's lips trembled, but she nodded. Her voice, when it came, was steady. "Then I shall make England remember me." They embraced once, brief, fierce, unspoken. A mother's last gift to a daughter who would soon face a realm of strangers and serpents. The ship, the Saint Michel, stood ready. Its hull glistened with tar, its banners bearing the cross of St. George alongside the lilies of Anjou, a symbol of fragile unity painted upon wood that would soon meet the fury of the Channel. Margaret climbed the gangplank with measured grace. Behind her, her retinue followed. Noblewomen, knights, priests, and servants, all bound for a new world. Each step echoed upon the wood like a tolling bell. As she reached the deck, she turned once more to the shore. Her father raised his hand in blessing. Her mother stood motionless, a silhouette of strength against the breaking light. And as the anchor lifted, as the ropes fell away, the crowd bowed their heads. For though none dared speak it, they all felt it, the crossing of a threshold, the turning of an age. The sails caught the morning wind, swelling like pale ghosts above her. The coastline of France began to recede, shrinking into mist. The familiar towers of Anjou, the glint of her father's palace, the golden fields beyond, all faded into the horizon's gray. Margaret stood at the bow, her hand gripping the rail, the wind tangling her hair. Salt sprayed across her face, stinging her eyes, though she did not weep. She whispered, "Goodbye, my France. My heart will not return." The sea answered only with the crash of waves. The Channel was never merciful. By nightfall, black clouds gathered above the fleet, swallowing the pale stars. Rain began to fall in sheets, drumming against the deck like arrows upon shields. The wind howled through the rigging, turning the sails into howling beasts of canvas. Below deck, Margaret sat upon her narrow bunk, the crucifix still clutched in her hand. Her ladies prayed around her, their faces pale and drawn. Every creak of the hull sounded like the sea's threat to devour them. But Margaret did not flinch. She felt the ship tilt, felt her heart steady with each surge of the waves. For the first time she understood, if she could conquer the sea, she could conquer a kingdom. At dawn, the storm broke. The clouds tore apart, revealing streaks of gold sunlight piercing the mist. The sailors cheered softly. The water lay calm once more, though strewn with foam and fragments of shattered barrels. The sky had been cruel, but it had spared her. She climbed again to the deck. The air smelled of salt and ash, and there, upon the distant horizon, she saw it. England. A pale, ghostly outline beneath the rising sun. White cliffs towering from the sea like the bones of the world. Her heart pounded. That land, veiled in mist, was to be her home, her battlefield, her legacy. The crew fell silent as they neared the coast. A priest raised a golden cross toward the cliffs, chanting in Latin. Margaret watched, unblinking. Behind her, her banners fluttered, lilies and lions, France and England, fate and faith, bound together in uneasy union. As the ship glided into port, the wind carried the scent of rain and earth, foreign, strange, and cold. From the shore she saw a procession waiting, men in armor, their faces hidden beneath steel helms, women in fur cloaks, banners of the Red Cross snapping in the air. At their center stood a pale figure, a royal messenger bearing the seal of Henry VI. The crowd on the docks was smaller than the one she had left behind. No songs, no cheers, only the sound of waves and the cautious murmurs of a people unsure whether to welcome or to fear her. Still, Margaret lifted her chin and stepped forward. Each movement was deliberate, regal, unyielding. She was no longer the daughter of Anjou, she was the Queen of England, though the crown had not yet touched her brow. Thus ended the voyage of a girl, and began the reign of a woman who would bend the will of kings. Behind her lay the safety of her homeland. Before her stretched a kingdom divided by greed and prophecy. She had crossed the sea not only to be a bride, but to be a weapon, forged in silence, tempered by storm. The ship's anchor struck the harbor stones with a hollow clang. The ropes tightened, the gangway fell. Margaret stepped onto English soil for the first time, and in that moment, beneath a sky still trembling from the storm, history shifted upon its axis. For within that fragile, slender girl from Lorraine burned the spirit of 1,000 years of queens. And though the chronicles of men would one day name her the she-wolf of France, the sea that had carried her to destiny would forever whisper a different truth, that on that cold, gray morning, a girl became the storm itself. The gray dawn broke over the southern coast of England, cold and austere. The sea mist still clung to the harbor when the ship from France came sliding through the pale morning light, its sails tattered from the storm, its hull streaked with salt and shadow. For those waiting upon the docks of Portsmouth, it was not merely a vessel that approached, but a tide of fate itself. Within its hold came the new Queen of England, a girl of 15, whose name already stirred whispers of prophecy and dread. The people gathered in hushed clusters along the quayside, their breath ghosting in the chill air. Mothers clutched their children, fishermen wiped their hands upon rough linen, and knights in polished mail stood in uneasy silence. All eyes fixed upon the great ship as it drew near, and when she appeared upon the deck, slender, motionless, her cloak rippling in the sea wind, a murmur spread through the crowd, like a tremor of awe. Margaret of Anjou, daughter of kings and poets, had come to claim a throne not her own, in a land that did not yet know whether to love her or to loathe her. As the gangway dropped, Margaret stepped forward, her shoes meeting the wet English planks, with a sound that seemed to echo across history. Behind her followed a retinue of nobles from Anjou, proud, elegant, and foreign in manner and dress. The English envoys who awaited her bowed deeply, though their eyes studied her with wary curiosity. Her gown was of deep blue velvet, embroidered with silver lilies, the arms of France. Upon her breast glimmered a small silver cross, a gift from her father. In her eyes burned the quiet fire of resolve. She had left behind her childhood, her homeland, her mother's tears, and now she stood upon the soil of a kingdom at war with itself. It was April 1445, and England was weary of blood. The long shadow of the 100 Years' War stretched across the Channel. A generation of Englishmen had known nothing but battle, loss, and ruin. The peace that brought Margaret to England was fragile, a truce sealed by her marriage to King Henry VI, a peace many already despised. To the nobles who had bled in France, the marriage was a betrayal. To the common folk, it was a mystery wrapped in fear, for they had heard she was the daughter of France, the daughter of their ancient enemy. To them, this pale foreign girl was no angel of peace. She was the price of defeat, and yet, The procession that followed was magnificent. From Portsmouth, the Queen's entourage wound its way through green fields and market towns, banners of both France and England fluttering side by side in the cold spring wind. Villagers lined the muddy roads to watch the strange spectacle, armored knights gleaming like living mirrors, horses draped in silken caparisons, heralds blowing trumpets to announce her passage. Children threw flowers beneath her carriage wheels, though some elders turned away, muttering prayers under their breath. French blood, they whispered. On English soil. Margaret heard the whispers, though she never turned her head. Her spine remained straight, her expression calm. Each mile carried her farther from the world she knew, and deeper into the labyrinth of English politics that would one day devour her. Her destination was Titchfield Abbey, a quiet sanctuary nestled among meadows and stone walls ivy-clad with spring growth. There, beneath the gaze of Christ and the trembling light of 1,000 candles, she was to meet her husband, the man who was both her fate and her undoing. Inside the abbey, the air was heavy with incense and expectation. Courtiers whispered along the walls. The Duke of Suffolk, architect of the marriage treaty, stood proudly at the altar's side. He had risked everything to secure this peace, and now he watched the young queen with calculating pride. For her success would be his triumph, and her failure, his ruin. At the appointed hour, King Henry VI entered. He was 23, tall, gentle, with eyes that seemed always half dreaming, as though he dwelled more in heaven than upon earth. His hands trembled as he approached her, his face pale from fasting and prayer. He was not the warrior king England longed for, but a saint cloaked in silk and frailty. When Margaret knelt before him, the court fell silent. The two figures, one frail and devout, the other young and fierce, seemed almost like reflections of two kingdoms bound by uneasy grace. He lifted her to her feet and said softly, "You are my beloved and gentle queen." His words trembled with tenderness. Margaret bowed her head, but in her heart a flicker of doubt stirred. For she saw at once the truth that no minister dared speak aloud, that England's king was a man of peace in a world ruled by war. The wedding festivities that followed were grand but tense. Nobles smiled through clenched teeth. Ambassadors traded glances like knives. Every toast, every word of praise for the union of hearts, concealed rivalries that ran deep as the roots of oak. At the high table, Margaret sat beside Henry, serene, radiant, her every gesture a study in grace. But her mind was already measuring the court around her. To her right sat William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk, the man who had arranged the marriage treaty that ceded Maine and Anjou back to France. To her left sat Cardinal Beaufort, the aging patriarch of the Lancastrian line, whose gaze betrayed both pride and unease. And beyond them, at the edges of the hall, the murmuring lords, Somerset, York, Salisbury, Warwick, men whose names would one day stain England's history with fire and blood. Margaret drank from her goblet, listening, watching, learning. Every smile seemed too sharp, every word too smooth. She had entered not a realm of peace, but a court of vipers. As night deepened, she withdrew to her new chambers. Through narrow windows, the English moon hung cold and distant. Not the soft golden moon of Anjou, but a pale ghost over an alien land. The air smelled of rain and smoke. The candles sputtered in the damp draught. Alone at last, she removed her jeweled veil and gazed into the looking-glass. For the first time, she saw herself not as daughter, not as bride, but as queen. The weight of that crown, invisible yet immense, pressed upon her shoulders. She whispered into the dark, "If I must rule a kingdom of wolves, then I too shall learn to bare my teeth." Outside her window, the abbey bells tolled midnight. England slept uneasily, dreaming of peace even as its nobles plotted for power. In the silence between those tolls, the first seeds of the Wars of the Roses began to take root. Unseen, unheard, inevitable. For though she could not yet know it, Margaret's arrival did not mark the end of strife, but the birth of a storm. A storm that would one day drench her name in blood and legend. The next day, Margaret and Henry began their royal journey toward London. The roads were lined with spectators, merchants, monks, peasants, nobles, each curious to behold their new queen. She waved from her carriage, her gloved hand steady, her smile soft yet distant. Children cheered, old men crossed themselves. Priests sang blessings as the procession passed beneath triumphal arches draped in red and gold. But beneath the joy lingered unease. For the common people knew what the courtiers whispered, that this marriage had come at a terrible price. The loss of Maine and Anjou had struck a deep wound into the English soul. These were lands won with English blood, lost now through negotiation, not battle. For every flower thrown at her feet, there was a muttered curse. "French witch," they hissed in corners. "She brings ruin with her beauty." Yet Margaret bore it all with quiet grace. Her carriage passed through villages still scarred by famine and plague, through castles half ruined by war. She saw the hollow eyes of beggars, the burned fields, the tattered flags, and in each she saw a kingdom wounded, leaderless, yearning for strength. And she thought, "If my husband cannot rule as a king, then I shall." It was not pride that moved her, but necessity. For even then she sensed the fragility of Henry's spirit. His goodness was too pure for the rough iron of kingship. He prayed when he should command. He forgave when he should act. He listened to angels, not to men. Margaret loved him, but she feared for him, and for the crown that would one day rest upon the head of their unborn son. Thus the Queen arrived in London, her carriage rolling through streets thick with onlookers and banners. The bells of St. Paul's rang out in solemn joy. From every window hung tapestries and garlands of flowers. From every alley came both cheers and curses. At Westminster, she was received with ceremony. The Archbishop blessed her in Latin. Nobles knelt, pledging allegiance to the crown. And as she stood before the gathered court, her youth radiant, her gaze unwavering, one could not help but see destiny taking form, not as a saint nor as a martyr, but as a lioness among sheep. In that moment, the fate of England turned upon a girl's shoulders. Behind her lay the kingdoms of France. Before her, the endless labyrinth of English ambition. Each noble's smile hid a dagger. Each vow of loyalty was a lie waiting to bloom. But Margaret of Anjou, fierce, intelligent, unyielding, would not bow and would not break. Though history would name her the she-wolf of France, the truth was far more terrible, for she had not come to devour England, but to save it, and in doing so, to lose herself within its crown of thorns. Thus began the reign of a queen, born of poetry, baptized by storm, and destined to walk through the fire of kings. May 1445. Westminster Abbey stands like a fortress of faith, its spires piercing the silver sky. Beneath the vaulted ceiling, hundreds gather, nobles draped in ermine, bishops robed in gold, soldiers standing like statues beneath banners of crimson and blue. The air is thick with incense, candle smoke, and the murmured prayers of a kingdom. And there, at the heart of it all, walks a girl barely 16 years old. Margaret of Anjou, daughter of France, bride of England, and the living promise of peace between two nations that had bled each other for a century. She moves slowly up the nave, the hem of her gown whispering against the cold stone floor. Pearls shimmer across her veil, and her hands tremble, not from fear, but from the weight of the moment. Every eye watches her, measuring, judging. When the Archbishop raises the golden circlet, the crown of England, a hush falls across the abbey. The metal gleams like the sun itself, ancient, sacred, and cruelly heavy. As the crown lowers upon her brow, Margaret feels the cold bite of destiny. The cheers rise, echoing through the vaulted arches, but behind the noise, behind the applause, she hears something else, a whisper of warning, a shadow that chills the heart. Every crown is a curse in disguise. Margaret kneels before the altar as choirs sing of divine right and eternal union. But her thoughts are not of God. They are of power, of survival. She knows that this ceremony is only the beginning. The abbey is not just a place of worship. It is a stage. And upon that stage, her every word, her every gesture, will be weighed like gold dust in the scales of politics. She glances sideways. There stands King Henry VI, her husband, her sovereign. His eyes are downcast, gentle, almost childlike. His hands fidget at his sides. To Margaret, he seems not a king, but a scholar trapped in robes too heavy for his spirit. And in that instant, she understands. If England is to endure, she must rule it. The coronation feast that follows is a display of opulence. Golden goblets, roasted boar, sweet wine, and laughter echoing beneath the high timbered roof. Yet behind the mirth lie murmurs, nobles whispering of France's daughter, this foreign girl who now wears their crown. Margaret smiles graciously, plays her part as queen, but she reads the tension in every glance. The Duke of Gloucester's cold stare, the Archbishop's measured politeness. Even Suffolk, her greatest ally, hides unease behind flattery. The hall is full of men of lineage, ambition, and pride, who will never forgive her for being both French and powerful. Later, when the torches dim and the guests retire, Margaret walks alone through the shadowed corridors of Westminster. The great stone walls seem to hum with ancient secrets. Her footsteps echo softly, steady, purposeful. She pauses before a window. London sprawls beneath her, a sea of rooftops fading into mist. The Thames glimmers under moonlight, like a blade drawn from its sheath. She presses her palm to the glass and whispers, "They cheer for me now, but how long before they curse me?" In the days that follow, England celebrates its new queen. Bells ring in every city. Children carry garlands of flowers through muddy streets. Chroniclers record her grace, her beauty, her poise, but they do not see the steel beneath it all. Margaret learns swiftly. She studies the faces of court, their rivalries, their loyalties, their weaknesses. She listens, remembers, plans. And as her husband retreats further into his books and prayers, she begins to understand the true nature of kingship. That sometimes, to protect peace, one must prepare for war. But there are whispers in the corridors, whispers of discontent. Some say Henry is unfit to rule. Some say England needs a stronger hand. And in those whispers, Margaret hears the first tremors of the storm that will one day tear the realm apart. Still, she walks with her head held high, the weight of her crown pressing like judgment upon her skull. She will not yield, not to the courtiers who mock her, not to the lords who doubt her, not to the people who still call her the French queen, She will be more than a bride, more than a token of peace. She will be a ruler in her own right, fierce, unbending, and unforgettable. On the night before her first royal council, Margaret dreams of her homeland, of Anjou's lavender fields, of her mother's laughter, of the sun on the Loire River. But when she wakes, she finds herself in a different world, a kingdom of swords and secrets, where compassion is weakness and mercy is a luxury few can afford. She rises from her bed, slips on her robe, and gazes once more at the sleeping city beyond her window. "France made me noble," she whispers, "but England will make me strong." And so, the girl from Anjou, the child of peace treaties and royal bargains, begins her transformation. The crown has been placed upon her brow. The curse has begun its work. From this day forth, she is not merely Margaret. She is the Queen of England, and soon she will become the she-wolf of France. Spring, 1445. England breathes in uneasy silence. The 100 Years' War has left scars upon the land. Burned villages, empty coffers, widows by the thousands. The English crown, once feared across the Channel, now trembles under the weight of defeat and debt. It is into this landscape of weary peace and fragile hope that Margaret of Anjou steps, a bride not of love, but of politics. Her marriage to King Henry VI is more than a union between two people. It is a desperate truce between two exhausted kingdoms. The treaty that sealed her hand was signed not in triumph, but in compromise. England agreed to return the lands of Maine and Anjou to France, a bitter concession that humiliated many lords who had fought and bled for those territories. To them, this marriage symbolized surrender. To Margaret, it was a chance to forge her destiny. When the royal ship arrived at Southampton, the crowds were curious, not adoring. They stared as she stepped ashore, a French girl, barely 16, her eyes sharp as flint beneath a golden veil. She carried herself like a queen already, her movements graceful yet deliberate, every gesture steeped in purpose. Behind her trailed an entourage of French ladies, servants, and soldiers, a living reminder of the land England both envied and despised. To the English nobles, she was the embodiment of everything they mistrusted: French blood, French pride, French cunning. But Margaret was no ordinary bride. Raised in the cultured courts of Anjou and Lorraine, she had been educated not in poetry or embroidery, but in diplomacy and in survival. Her mother, Queen Isabella of Lorraine, had taught her one unshakable lesson. A queen's heart must be kind, but her spirit must be iron. And so, as she rode through the streets of London for the first time, Margaret smiled for the crowds. But her gaze measured every noble watching her from behind their banners. She would learn their names, their ambitions, and their weaknesses. She was entering not a marriage, but a battlefield. The early months of her reign seemed peaceful. King Henry VI treated her with the tenderness of a scholar rather than the passion of a husband. He was gentle, devout, and absent-minded, more monk than monarch. He spoke of charity, of education, of peace, but he did not speak of power. To Margaret, this was both a blessing and a burden. She saw in him not strength, but fragility. A man too easily swayed by advisors, too quick to forgive, too reluctant to lead. And in the shadows of the royal court, other men noticed this weakness too. Among them stood William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk, the architect of Margaret's marriage. He was clever, ambitious, and calculating, the king's most trusted counselor, and the man who had arranged this Franco-English alliance. To Suffolk, Margaret was both a triumph and a liability. Through her, he hoped to secure his influence, to rule through her soft words and sharp intellect. But Margaret was not a pawn. She listened, she learned, and she began to act. Within weeks of her coronation, she established her own circle of loyal attendants, women and clerics who reported not to Suffolk or Henry, but to her. She began to write letters to French relatives, building quiet channels of communication across the Channel. She paid attention to every rumor, every whisper, every noble's reaction when her name was spoken. Yet the seeds of resentment were already being sown. In taverns and great halls alike, the English grumbled that their queen was too proud, too foreign, too bold. Whispers called her the French witch, a woman who controlled their pious king with spells of charm and deceit. And when word spread that Maine, an English possession, had been ceded to France as part of her marriage agreement, the whisper became a roar. They said she had betrayed England before she had even learned its language. Margaret's arrival at court marked the beginning of a new kind of struggle, not one of armies and banners, but of words and alliances. She navigated a maze of ambition. The proud Duke of Gloucester, who saw her as a symbol of England's humiliation. Cardinal Beaufort, the aging kingmaker, whose loyalty was to the church before the crown. And Richard, Duke of York, a distant cousin to Henry, a man with royal blood and growing ambition of his own. Every smile she offered was a mask, every conversation a duel. In a world ruled by men, she learned that power came not from strength of arm, but from the art of survival. At night, Margaret would write in her diary, lines few would ever read. "I am queen of a kingdom divided," she wrote. "They look upon me and see France, not their sovereign, but their enemy. Yet I will teach them to respect me, even if they must first learn to fear me." Her words would prove prophetic. As the years passed, her influence grew, and so did the enmity around her. The Duke of Suffolk's favor made her the target of every grievance at court. When the treasury emptied, they blamed the Queen's French excess. When soldiers mutinied in Normandy, they blamed her marriage. When the people starved, they whispered her name with venom. And still, she endured. She smiled in public, schemed in private, and prayed in silence. For Margaret understood what others did not. Peace is never given. It is taken, shaped, and defended by those strong enough to bear the hatred of others. The marriage alliance that began as a promise of unity had instead become a knife, dividing noble from noble, crown from subject, husband from wife. And in that fracture, Margaret of Anjou began to evolve. No longer the young bride who had crossed the sea to secure peace, she was becoming something far more formidable. She was learning what it meant to rule in a kingdom built on distrust. And soon, when England's crown faltered and its king's mind began to crumble, it would be Margaret, the foreign queen, the outsider, who would rise to defend it. The girl from Anjou had been sent to England to end a war, but fate had chosen her for something greater and far darker. For peace, she would sacrifice everything. For power, she would embrace the storm, and the storm was already gathering. England, 1447. The kingdom stands upon the edge of silence, a silence so fragile that even a whisper of treason could shatter it. The honeymoon of peace has ended. The marriage that once promised unity now bears the weight of suspicion. Margaret of Anjou, now Queen of England, walks the corridors of Westminster not as a bride, but as a ruler in training, one surrounded by men who see her not as sovereign, but as a stranger. Her husband, King Henry VI, drifts deeper into his piety and prayer. His eyes, once filled with timid kindness, now stare past his counsel as if lost in another world. He speaks of visions and divine mercy, of charity and heaven, while the kingdom beneath him bleeds in quiet ruin. The people murmur, the nobles whisper, and the queen listens. In the heart of the royal court, the true war begins, not fought with swords, but with words, alliances, and the slow poison of ambition. The Duke of Gloucester, uncle to the king, challenges Suffolk's control of the crown. The old lords of England, proud of their heritage, bristle at this young French queen's growing confidence. And through it all, Margaret learns the art of patience, of smiling at her enemies while memorizing their weaknesses. She begins to shape the court around her. Loyal ladies attend her councils. Trusted clerks record her correspondence. Every banquet, every sermon, every whispered audience becomes another thread in the web she quietly spins around the throne. But webs are delicate, and England's throne, more fragile still. The year turns cold. Whispers become accusations. The Duke of Gloucester is charged with treason, a crime none dare speak openly, yet all believe the Queen had a hand in. They say she conspired with Suffolk to silence him, to rid the realm of its loudest critic. Whether truth or lie, it matters little, for the Duke of Gloucester is found dead in his cell before he can speak a word in his own defense. London gasps. The streets erupt in fury, and the name Margaret of Anjou becomes a curse upon the lips of the common people. They call her the French witch, the woman who brings death wherever she treads, the one who bends England's gentle king to her will. But Margaret does not flinch. She has seen the cruelty of politics in France, and she knows that mercy is a coin few can afford. She orders the court to continue. The feasts go on. The processions march. The crown must appear unbroken, even as the kingdom fractures beneath it. In the shadows of power, Margaret's closest ally, the Duke of Suffolk, grows bold and reckless. He controls the treasury, commands the king's ear, and shapes policy to his own will. Yet arrogance is the poison of all favorites. When English armies lose Normandy to the French, the people demand vengeance. They do not blame the generals. They blame Suffolk, and through him, they blame the Queen. Sound cue. Waves crashing, the creak of wood, the moan of wind at sea. Suffolk is seized, condemned without trial, and sent into exile. But fate has no mercy for the fallen. As his ship sails from the coast of Dover, English sailors board it in the night. They drag him onto the deck, his face pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. Without ceremony, they strike him down and cast his lifeless body into the dark sea. The waves swallow him whole, and with him, the last of Margaret's peace. When news reaches London, the Queen does not weep, not in public, not before the nobles who watch her like vultures circling their prey. She stands at the window of Windsor Castle, staring out across the grey Thames. The wind howls through the open arches. The river below is still and cold, the color of lead. And in that silence, she vows that she will never again be powerless. If England will not love her, then it will fear her. If the nobles will not serve her, then she will command them. If her husband cannot rule, then she will rule in his name, by word, by will, or by war. The fragile crown has begun to crack, but beneath its breaking, something fierce is being born. The peace is dead, the alliance has rotted, and in its place, a queen of fire begins to rise, no longer the bride of compromise, but the architect of England's coming storm. For from the ashes of betrayal, Margaret of Anjou will carve her legacy, the queen who defied kings, challenged fate, and earned a name that history would whisper for centuries to come. The she-wolf of France. The year is 1453. England stands on the edge of despair. The long, bitter war with France is over and lost. Normandy, Gascony, and all the proud possessions once claimed by the Plantagenet crown are gone. The banners of England, once flying over French castles, now lie trampled in the mud, and at home, famine and plague stalk the weary. The people no longer cheer their king's name. They whisper it with pity and contempt. King Henry VI, the pious, gentle soul once crowned in both France and England, has collapsed beneath the weight of failure. His mind, fragile as glass, has shattered into silence. He neither speaks, nor eats, nor recognizes his queen. In his absence, the kingdom stumbles into chaos. The lords of England circle like wolves around a wounded stag, each one hungering for the throne's power. Among them stands a man whose ambition burns brighter than any, Richard, Duke of York. But between him and the crown stands one woman, Margaret of Anjou. At Windsor, the queen walks alone. The corridors of power have grown cold. The courtiers who once bowed now whisper. The council meets without her. But Margaret does not weep. She waits. She studies. She listens to every word carried through the court like smoke. And then she moves. With the king lost in his own broken mind, the queen takes the reins of rule. She calls her loyal lords, Somerset, Exeter, Northumberland, and one by one binds them to her cause. Letters sealed with her royal mark fly across England, summoning armies under the pretense of defense, but in truth, to prepare for war. The nobles scoff. She is but a woman, they say. She knows nothing of kingship or battle. But those who have met her gaze know better. There is fire behind those eyes, the same fire that once burned in the warriors of Anjou. Then, in the winter of that same year, a miracle, or a curse, stirs the sleeping king. Henry wakes from his stupor. He blinks, looks around, and murmurs softly, "Where is my son?" A son. A boy born during his father's madness. The Prince of Wales, Edward of Westminster. And now, in that frail, miraculous return to awareness, the king's first thought is of him. The court rejoices. The bells of London toll, but beneath the joy, a cold dread coils in the heart of the Yorkist lords. For this child is not merely an heir, he is a weapon. For Margaret knows what the birth of her son means. It is her proof of legitimacy, her living shield. Through him, she cements her line, her claim, her power. And from that day forward, every action she takes, every decision she makes, will be for him. The child who will one day wear England's crown, but peace will not last. The Duke of York, emboldened by his followers, gathers an army. He marches south, banners unfurled, claiming to protect the realm from the Queen's corruption. Margaret rides out to meet him, a French-born queen commanding English soldiers, a sight that chills even her allies. The two forces collide near St. Albans. Steel meets steel in the muddy fields of Hertfordshire. The air fills with the cries of the dying and the thunder of hooves. By nightfall, York triumphs. The Queen's allies lie slain, and King Henry captured. England has witnessed the first blood of what will be known as the Wars of the Roses. But the Queen endures. She flees north, wounded in pride but not defeated. In the castles of Wales and the forests of Cheshire, she gathers strength once more. Messengers ride day and night. Coins are minted in her name. Armies rise again. And as she watches the snow fall on her husband's broken crown, Margaret vows that this war, this England, will be hers to command. She will not kneel, she will not yield, she will not forgive. They call her proud, they call her ruthless. But in the dim light of her candle, Margaret of Anjou writes a letter to her captains. Her words are simple. We will reclaim all that has been taken from us. By the spring of 1459, her cause is reborn. Armies once loyal to York now shift their allegiance, drawn by her courage, her fury, her sheer will to fight. She stands before her soldiers, the wind whipping her veil, her son at her side. No longer the frightened bride from Anjou, no longer the silent queen behind a frail king. She has become the voice of defiance, a mother, a commander, a sovereign in all but name. And when she raises her hand, an army roars in answer. The wolves of England have chosen their queen. In the ashes of defeat, she has found her purpose. In the madness of her husband, she has found her strength. And as England tears itself apart, one truth remains unshaken. Margaret of Anjou will not rest until her enemies lie broken before her. For she is no longer the gentle consort of a failing king. She is the she-wolf of France. (1455). England trembles on the brink of civil war. The fragile peace that Margaret of Anjou sought to preserve has shattered. The crown, once a symbol of divine order, now lies fractured between rival factions, each claiming the right to govern in the name of the king. The first clash comes at St. Albans. The Duke of York, emboldened by his supporters and convinced of his duty to protect the realm from corruption, raises arms against the king. But this time, he is not facing a passive court. Margaret has learned, she has prepared. She is no longer merely a queen in name, she is a queen in command. The Lancastrian army, led in part by the queen herself, marches to meet York's forces. Fields once tilled by peasants now run with the tension of impending bloodshed. Soldiers tighten their grips on spears, knights adjust their helmets, and the banners of Lancaster, red roses emblazoned with the king's emblem, snap sharply in the cold wind. And then, battle erupts. Steel meets steel. Horses rear and fall. The cries of men fill the air, mingling with the clatter of hooves and the shriek of the wounded. By day's end, York emerges victorious, but not unscathed. Margaret retreats strategically, not in defeat, but to preserve her forces for the storm that is yet to come. This is not just a war of men, it is a war of wills. Margaret's power grows not through titles, but through strategy. She writes letters to loyal lords, sending secret orders and promises. She raises funds where the treasury falters. She negotiates with allies in France, securing both men and material. The people begin to speak her name in fear and awe. The she-wolf of France, they murmur. For she fights not only with sword and army, but with cunning, determination, and the instinct of a mother protecting her son, Prince Edward of Westminster. The Wars of the Roses sweep across England. St. Albans is only the beginning. From Blore Heath to Wakefield, the battlefield becomes a chessboard of strategy and betrayal. Margaret rides at the front, a figure of both inspiration and terror to her soldiers. She observes the battlefield, her eyes calculating, her voice carrying commands that turn chaos into order. At Wakefield, the Lancastrian forces strike decisively. Richard, Duke of York, falls in battle, his death sending shockwaves through England. Yorkist lords flee or are captured. The Queen, bloodied but unbroken, has turned the tide, at least for a moment, but triumph brings its own danger. York's son, Edward, now Edward IV, grows in both cunning and ambition. England has become a stage of endless struggle, a kingdom in which every victory is fleeting, and every defeat threatens to unravel everything. Margaret's war is not only fought on the fields, it is waged in castles, in whispered councils, and in the corridors of power. She brokers alliances with foreign rulers, arranges marriages to secure loyalty, and ensures her son remains the beacon of Lancastrian legitimacy. Yet the toll is heavy. Every battle leaves families shattered. Every city burned or pillaged deepens the resentment of a weary people. And every step Margaret takes toward victory fuels the fire of Yorkist vengeance. Through these years, Margaret evolves from queen consort to warrior, strategist, and symbol. She embodies the heart of the Lancastrian cause, relentless, cunning, and unyielding. Her enemies call her ruthless. Her supporters call her protector. But all know this: she will not yield. England is a kingdom divided, but Margaret of Anjou stands unbroken. She has embraced the storm. She has become the she-wolf of France, fierce, unrelenting, and ready to fight for every crown, every title, and every life she holds dear. By 1461, the tides of war have turned. Edward IV, son of Richard, Duke of York, has claimed the throne. The Lancastrian banner has fallen, and with it, Margaret of Anjou, once the fierce heart of England's defense, is forced to flee. She does not weep in the halls of Westminster. She does not bow to the victors. Her crown may be lost, but her will is unbroken. Margaret gathers what remains of her loyalists, soldiers, servants, and noble allies who refuse to bend to Yorkist rule. She carries with her the hopes of a dynasty, the safety of her son, and the fire of vengeance. Her destination: France, a land both familiar and foreign. Here, in exile, she must rebuild her strength, secure alliances, and prepare to reclaim the crown stolen from her family. Arriving in the court of King Louis I, Margaret steps into a world of politics as dangerous as any battlefield. France, though at peace with Edward IV's England, is divided by its own ambitions. The Queen must navigate courtly intrigue with precision. Every word, every gesture, every alliance carries weight, for she is a queen without a kingdom, yet her presence alone commands attention. She appeals to her French relatives, reminding them of her bloodline and her claims. She negotiates for soldiers, ships, and money. Letters fly across the Channel, rallying support from loyal Lancastrians still hiding in the shadows of England. Yet exile is not merely political, it is personal. Her husband, Henry VI, remains a prisoner in England, his mind fractured and his body weak. Her son, Edward, is only a child, the symbol of Lancastrian legitimacy, yet vulnerable to Yorkist plots. Margaret bears the weight of her dynasty on her shoulders. Every decision could save her family or doom them entirely. And every step is watched by spies, rivals, and the ever-present shadow of war. She forms alliances with the Duke of Lorraine, the Duke of Bourbon, and other sympathetic nobles. Ships are readied, funds are gathered, and armies slowly take shape. In exile, Margaret becomes not just a survivor, but a strategist, a commander plotting the return of her lost kingdom. And yet, the years in exile are lonely. She watches Europe's courts with careful eyes, knowing that every friendship may hide betrayal, and every offer of aid may conceal ulterior motives. But Margaret does not despair. She channels her grief, her anger, and her fear into determination. Every setback becomes fuel. Every insult, every loss, every exile strengthens her resolve. From the hills of France, she plans the Lancastrian resurgence. She rallies old allies, sends envoys into England, and whispers promises of vengeance that echo across the Channel. She is no longer the young bride sent to secure peace. She is the queen in exile, the mother of the heir, the architect of a war yet to be won. Exile may have taken her throne, but it cannot take her spirit. Margaret of Anjou endures, plotting, scheming, and waiting. And though England is lost for now, she knows that power, like blood, cannot be extinguished so easily. The she-wolf of France has gone into exile, but her return will be stormy, relentless, and unforgettable. The year is 1470. Years in exile have sharpened Margaret of Anjou's resolve. Every loss, every betrayal, every cruel exile has forged her into a queen of action, not mere title. Across the Channel, England waits. Divided, weary, and vulnerable. Margaret does not return alone. She comes with soldiers loyal to her cause, with allies gathered in foreign courts, and with the determination of a mother and queen who will reclaim what was stolen. Her landing is strategic. She touches English soil first at Dover, a place of both hope and danger. The people watch, uncertain. Whispers ripple through towns and villages. The she-wolf of France has returned. The Yorkist king, Edward IV, is preoccupied by other threats, leaving openings for Margaret to maneuver. She rallies Lancastrian supporters from the shadows, nobles, knights, and even townspeople who remain loyal to Henry VI. Messages fly across counties. Secret meetings are held in dark forests, abandoned abbeys, and quiet castles. Margaret's strategy is patient, cunning, and relentless. She does not seek immediate open battle. She rebuilds her army, fortifies alliances, and gathers intelligence on Yorkist positions. Her son, Edward of Westminster, now a young teenager, becomes a symbol around which Lancastrian forces rally. As she marches south, towns surrender without a fight, drawn by her reputation and the promise of restoring Lancastrian rule. Every step of her journey is a statement. Margaret has returned, not as a bride, not as a consort, but as the sovereign power behind a kingdom in turmoil. At Rochester and Coventry, her forces meet Yorkist resistance. Skirmishes erupt, swift, brutal, and calculated. Though outnumbered, Margaret's leadership inspires her troops, and her tactics strike fear into the hearts of Yorkist commanders. By autumn, her campaign reaches its zenith. Edward IV is forced to flee London. Henry VI is restored to the throne, though fragile and wary. For a brief, shining moment, the Lancastrian crown returns to the queen who never yielded, who never abandoned her cause. But triumph carries its own shadows. The Yorkists regroup, plotting revenge. The fragile peace Margaret fought to restore is brittle, and the seeds of future conflict are already sown. Yet in this moment, Margaret stands victorious. She has crossed seas, navigated treacherous courts, led armies, and outmaneuvered rivals. England bends, at least for now, to the will of a queen who refuses to bow. Her son sits at her side, the future heir to a crown she has defended with unrelenting courage. The she-wolf of France has returned to England, Margaret of Anjou is no longer merely a player in the game of kings. She is a strategist, a mother, and a force of history itself. England may be divided, but her legacy has been cemented in the hearts and minds of all who witness her return. And though the storms of war are far from over, one truth remains. The she-wolf has reclaimed her land, at least for now. The year is 1471. England, once again, trembles under the shadow of civil war. The brief restoration of Henry VI and the Lancastrian crown has crumbled. Edward IV has returned from exile, his forces sharp, disciplined, and relentless. Margaret of Anjou, the she-wolf of France, has fought with cunning, courage, and unyielding determination. She has rallied armies, navigated foreign courts, and returned to her kingdom against all odds. Yet even her iron will cannot bend the tides of fortune forever. The decisive confrontation comes at Tewkesbury. Lancastrian forces march bravely to meet Edward IV's seasoned troops. The air is thick with tension. Banners snap in the wind. Dust rises in choking clouds, and the clangor of armor fills the battlefield. Margaret rides at the front, her eyes blazing with determination. Her son, Edward of Westminster, barely 16, fights beside her, a symbol of Lancastrian hope. But hope proves fragile. Yorkist strategy and superior numbers crush the Lancastrians. The battlefield becomes a scene of chaos, desperation, and loss. Edward of Westminster falls. The last male heir of Henry VI lies dead on the blood-soaked fields of Tewkesbury. Margaret witnesses the unthinkable, her son, her legacy, extinguished. Her grief is immense, but she must survive. For if she falls, the Lancastrian line, already fragile, will vanish completely. Margaret is captured and taken prisoner. The she-wolf of France, once feared by her enemies and revered by her followers, is reduced to a symbol of defeat. Henry VI, her husband, dies shortly afterward. Some say by grief, others by Yorkist hands. The dynasty she fought for, bled for, and schemed to protect is no more. Yet even in defeat, Margaret's story endures. She lives out her remaining years in captivity. Far from the throne she defended with unmatched fervor. Her power is gone, but her legend, the courage, intelligence, and indomitable will, cannot be taken. She is remembered as a queen who defied expectation, who challenged kings and lords alike, and who fought for her son and her crown until the very end. Margaret of Anjou's dynasty may have fallen, but the she-wolf's legacy lives on in history, a testament to ambition, resilience, and the unyielding spirit of a queen who refused to bow. The years pass slowly in exile and captivity. Margaret of Anjou, once feared and admired as the she-wolf of France, now lives in quiet obscurity. Her crown is gone, her armies are scattered, her husband and son are dead. The England she fought to protect has moved on, the Yorkists ruling with a firm hand. Yet even in silence, Margaret's presence remains formidable. Her mind, sharp as ever, recalls every battle, every betrayal, every political maneuver that defined her life. She writes letters, some sent, most hidden, documenting her struggles, her strategies, her legacy. She is a queen without a throne, a mother without her child, a force without an army. Her captors recognize her intellect and determination, and even in confinement, she commands attention. Courtiers and soldiers whisper her name with a mixture of fear and respect. She is a ghost of power, haunting the memory of England's turbulent years. Time erodes her influence, but not her will. She survives in a world that has forgotten her victories, her cunning, and her indomitable spirit. Though the she-wolf of France is no longer a player in the game of kings, she remains undefeated in dignity, intelligence, and the legacy of defiance she carved into history. Margaret's story is a reminder that history often favors the victors, but courage, strategy, and resilience leave marks that cannot be erased. Her life, marked by triumphs and tragedies, by love and loss, by exile and fleeting restoration, endures as a testament to the strength of a queen who refused to yield. In the shadows of castles, in the pages of history, in the memory of a divided kingdom, Margaret of Anjou lives on. Not as a ruler of lands, but as a queen of spirit, a woman whose legacy transcends her defeats, whose story inspires generations, and whose name, once whispered with fear, is remembered with reverence.
Subscribe for more untold history.